Thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you again tonight. Well, in our group, there's been our Cooking from Scratch on Debbie's Back Porch. There's been a lot of discussion about roasting as opposed to other ways to cook meat. And I have a nice little pork roast, a Boston butt, and I thought, well, I don't have beef because I really can't afford a roast beef right now. But I do have a nice piece of pork, and so I'm going to go through the discussion of roasting versus braising versus grilling versus frying. It'll be quick, I promise not to bore you. And then we'll have a pork roast for supper. I'm also going to make a side dish to go with it, but I'll put that in a separate video. And I'm going to be using my roaster, but you can use your oven if you'd prefer. So let's get to it and let's roast a Boston butt. Be right back. Well, here we have the star of the show. This is a Boston butt. Generally, well, always, a Boston butt is not the butt of the pork. It's a shoulder, and it's generally not cured, and it has a different texture than the ham. This is a pretty tender, potentially tender cut of meat. This particular one is 4.5 pounds, and it's way too much for a meal for Fred and me, and we're not having company tonight that I know of yet. So when I cook a roast, either pork or beef, I generally plan to get at least 3 meals from it, and perhaps 4. So my plan for this is to cook it tonight, and we'll just have roast pork, maybe a little barbecue sauce on the side, and I'm going to cook a cabbage dish to go with it. And then tomorrow night, I'll chop up some of it and make pozole. And then the next night, I will make sliced barbecue. If there's any left, or if I see when I'm done that there's going to be some left, I'll freeze a little bit of it for pozole later. But a lot of it depends on the size and whether or not somebody drops by to eat. So I will show you the pozole in another video, by the way, because it's a yummy soup. And folks don't tend to think of pork in soup as much as they do beef or chicken. And pozole is a lovely, lovely soup. It has lots of different flavors in it, and it's just a little exotic. So I'll make that for you probably tomorrow night. Roasting. Roasting is cooking on a rack, open in your oven or in a roaster. You don't cover it. You don't put any water in it. People will argue about salt, when to salt, if to salt. Very few people argue about if to salt. The question is when. If you're roasting meat, you need to let it come to room temperature. It needs to truly be fully thawed all the way through. One way of salting it is to brine it ahead of time, and I often brine beef overnight with about a tablespoonful of sugar, a tablespoonful of salt in a half gallon of water, enough to cover it. And then you take it out and you dry the brine off. There's something people call dry brine or dry rub, and that's what I'm going to do with this one. People discuss and disagree on different ways to use salt when you're roasting. I can only tell you what works for me, and when I find a lot of documentation from different chefs and cooks to back up. But I always salt meat before I cook it. Generally, I salt it pretty close to the time I'm going to cook it. A lot of people say it must be an hour ahead. A lot of people say, well, you salt it and then the time ahead of time is determined by how thick the meat is. There seems to be a feeling among some people that salt dries out the meat, and therefore you shouldn't use it. And my way of thinking is that salt dries out the surface of the meat, and therefore you should use it, because moist meat won't brown. And I use salt, or often dry rub, which is a mixture of salt and some spices and some sugar, which is what I'm going to use tonight. because it does dry the surface of the meat. I mean, if you'll look at this meat, if I put some salt on the surface, it is not going to make the inside tough. It's not going to dry out the inside. It will never get that far. What it will do is to pull the moisture out of the surface and help it brown and give it that sort of crackly taste and feel. So that's my theory of salting. You should use your own theory of salting. But I always salt meat before I cook it and have been pretty happy with the results. A dry rub is generally used on roasted meat. You can use it on grilled meat. So that's roasting. Let's talk about the difference in braising, because another thing that also comes up often is people say, well, I got my roast and I put this much broth in the pan and I put all of these spices and stuff in the broth. Roasting meat does not generally include water. I had a discussion today with a lady in the porch, Diane, and she puts water on the bottom to catch the drippings. That's not what I'm talking about. That's fine. I'm talking about in roasting meat, you don't submerge any part of the meat in water. You put it on a rack so that the drippings fall down. And then those drippings are wonderful. I'm going to use those drippings to make a cabbage dish later. But roasting is above the surface. And that's for certain cuts of meat. Braising is cooking in water, in liquid. Can be broth, can be tomato sauce, whatever liquid you want to use. Can be barbecue sauce. But if you cook something at a low heat, generally covered in liquid, that's braising. And when you think of Grandma's pot roast with all that wonderful juice and the carrots and onions and potatoes and maybe celery all cooked in the juice, and the roast is covered about halfway up with liquid, and you get that wonderful gravy from it, that's braising. And if you cook in your crock pot, almost always what you're doing is braising, because you're cooking low and slow in liquid. I have several videos. Another method of cooking meat is frying, and I have several videos on that, so I won't spend any time talking about it. And then there's grilling, and I'm not going to presume to tell people about grilling because I don't think I'm very good at it, and because everybody has their own way, and for some people how they grill is almost a religion. But you know what grilling is. It's cooking on charcoal or smoking. And I just actually prefer roasted or braised meat when you have a large piece. Braising is something you generally do with a cut of meat that would otherwise be tough. You know, if you took a chuck roast and just cooked it open on a rack in the oven, it's probably going to be tough. A brisket, it's probably going to be tough. It may not be tough, but it probably will be. And that's why you braise it low and slow in a liquid, and that helps dissolve the cartilage and the muscle tissue that's all through the meat. And you don't need to do that with every cut of meat. So that's enough. We're going to prepare this for roasting the way I roast it. And I'm going to roast it with a dry rub. So another discussion that came up today is, what is the fat cap? When you get meat, it almost always has a layer of fat. And the funny thing about pork is pastured pork has more fat. Factory pork has less because people tend to ask for more lean meat. So agribusiness tries to make pork leaner, and they try to make beef fatter. Don't ask me why, but it's making them a lot of money. So pastured pork is going to have a thicker fat cap. I don't cut this off for roasting. If I were frying a pork chop with this much fat, I might trim it, and if I were canning it, I for certain would trim it. But for roasting, that fat is going to hold in the flavor. As it cooks, it's going to diffuse. The flavor is going to diffuse all through. So we leave it. And you always roast meat with the fat side up for that reason. So let's get to roasting. The dry rub, not everybody does this, but I have found that the dry rub stays on better if you rub the meat in oil. This is sunflower oil. You can rub it in any kind of oil you like. I never use corn or canola, by the way. And this is a dry rub that I made a few days ago when I was doing some pork spare ribs. And so if you're interested in the dry rub recipe, it's in that video. So just enough, rubbing it in just enough oil. Which, by the way, I patted this dry too. I'm sorry I didn't show you that. When you're roasting meat, you want to pat the moisture off of it. And I got ahead of myself. You just pat it dry with a paper towel. And yes, this mixture is about half salt. And I did use kosher salt. And I have my roaster heating to 350, preheating. And if I were cooking it in the oven, I would probably cook it on 325, but I find you lose some heat in the roaster. So between 325 and 350, either is okay. And for 145 degrees internal temperature, this should take about 20 minutes per pound. This is 4.5 pounds. I'm actually going to cook this to, I hope, 150 degrees, only because we like it a little doner, but generally accepted temperature is 140 to 145. I just don't want any pink left in pork. Old habits die hard. Okay, so this has been rubbed on all sides with a dry rub, which is basically salt, brown sugar, and some spices of your choice. This is going in the roaster on a rack. I'll close it up. I'll set my timer for, let's see, 4 hours at 20 minutes a pound would be 80 minutes, and half a pound would be another 10, an hour and a half. It probably will have to cook a little bit longer than that, but at an hour and a half, I'm going to stick the meat thermometer in and check for internal temperature. And we'll be back in an hour and a half, and that's the recommended time. But as I told you, I generally cook it longer than the recommended time. But we're going to try this meat thermometer and see what we get down in the middle. When you use a meat thermometer, you know to be very careful that you don't touch the bone, because that throws your temperature off. So we're aiming to get up here more closer to 150. I'm going to turn this back on for about another 45 minutes. Okay, there we go. We're going to try this again. Okay, I know this is kind of hard to see, but we're up to about 150, and that's the temperature I'm looking for. So I'll be right back and show you the next step. So, this pork roast is done, but there is one more step. You need to let it sit for a bit, 10 to 20 minutes, and rest before you cut it. While that's done, I'm going to finish up my side dish, and I'll come back and we'll plate it up for you. Well, here you have it. This is a roasted Boston butt, dry rubbed, no water, cooked in a roaster. And I can just tell you, the smell and the taste is wonderful. We let it sit for about 20 minutes, let it rest. You can see the juice running down through here. And you can see the juice in the pan, in the platter. So you know I have to try this, and I wish you could try it. It kind of dances around on your tongue. It's just wonderful. And the dry rub is part of the reason it's so good. Thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch. I hope you try this. You can try the same thing with a beef roast, and it'll turn out just as wonderful. See you again tomorrow.